We are surveying the Gospel according to John this year at Lakewoods Drive, and one of the passages that got left out for whatever reason is here in John chapter 18, verse 36, where Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world," in his conversation with Pilate. I don't know precisely why it was not included. Maybe I've preached on it 100 times and I didn't want to do 101, but today I do. Today I want to not just touch on this passage, but also look at it in the context of John chapter 18 and talk about what it means to have a kingdom that is otherworldly, a kingdom that does not pertain to this world in the sense that every other kingdom you've ever heard of pertains to this world. It's a difficult bar to leap, no question about that. Most of Jesus' contemporaries didn't understand it. As far as we can tell, his closest disciples didn't understand it until it was spoon-fed to them by the Holy Spirit in due course of time. Pilate certainly didn't understand it, but in the context of John chapter 18, I think it really comes out to us, and we really are left without excuse at the end of the day, because Jesus not only explains throughout the text, but especially he explains it here, what it means to have an otherworldly kingdom, and how we are going to need to reevaluate basically everything we think about with regard to kingdoms and governments and leaders and all the rest of it. And certainly our role as followers, our role as citizens in this heavenly kingdom. It's not going to be what we expect. It's going to be very, very different, in fact, at a core level. And we see that especially here in John chapter 18. Jesus could have said just as easily to Pilate, if you don't want to know what I mean by my kingdom is not of this world, you ought to go back in time and look at my life for the last 8-10 hours or so. And you'll see, really, there are several passages here in John chapter 18 that indicate the difference in Jesus' philosophy of kingdom versus Pilate's, obviously, and oftentimes ours as well. And by understanding what Jesus says and putting it in the proper framework, I think we're going to set ourselves up for a lot of proper understandings and avoid a lot of very fundamental misunderstandings in the text. If you back up to chapter 18 and verse number 4, when Jesus is being arrested, the account, of course, in John's gospel is very different from what we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm not going to try to reconcile those accounts here today, but we see Judas, just like in the others, coming to betray Jesus with a kiss. We read in verse number 4, when they arrived, "Then Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them," the arresting party, "Who is it that you're seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. "I am he," Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with them. When Jesus told them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, saying, "Who is it that you're seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. "I told you I'm he," Jesus replied. "So if you're looking for me, let these men go." Jesus realizes that arresting the Son of God, arresting the King of Kings, because of some kind of a petty notion that the high priest might have, this is par for the course. This is not especially unusual, in fact. God's people have always been persecuted. He said just a few days earlier, which one of the prophets did you not persecute, as it were? Jerusalem has always been willing and eager, in fact, to reject God's truth when it didn't suit and to punish God's messengers whenever no better alternative presented itself. So, although it may seem on the surface to be horrifying that Jesus would be treated the way that he was, in reality, it's not that much different. And that's the way Jesus and the kingdom of God is going to be for us as well. We see in Matthew chapter 5, verses 10, 11, and 12, how we're blessed. We're called blessed if we're persecuted for the kingdom's sake. "Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice," he says, "and be exceeding glad. Your reward in heaven is great, for so persecuted they the prophets who were before you." This is, again, always the way that it's worked out, and it's going to work out that way for you also. Now, that is a real problem for us, of course, because we, especially in modern day America, we have this sense of fairness and a certain amount of entitlement with regard to fairness. It's not right that we be treated poorly for doing something that's good and noble and selfless, and we deserve justice. We deserve retribution against our enemies. And Jesus is saying, not only are you not going to get that, but the very kingdom itself is based on the idea of not getting that. This is what an otherworldly kingdom is. We keep seeking some kind of short-term validation, some kind of tangible evidence that we're on the right track, and far too often we get exactly the opposite. Now, does that mean that Jesus is cruel? Does that mean that Jesus is impotent with regard to political matters, etc.? No, Jesus is going to win all the battles in due course of time. But he's allowing us to lose certain battles now, just as he lost battles in the short term. This is what an earthly kingdom, of course, it defines an earthly kingdom in terms of failure and incompetence and temporary nature, as it were. The idea that an eternal kingdom, a kingdom that's here forever, like Daniel prophesied about in Daniel chapter 2, that's this great boulder cut out of the mountain that's going to stand forever. This sure doesn't look like that. Well, it's one of many, many awakenings that the disciples are setting themselves up for. And before we criticize the disciples too much for their attitude, let's make sure that we look to our own selves here. This is not what we would think a kingdom is going to be, what a kingdom is going to look like. Jesus warns us ahead of time, and he tells us here in no uncertain terms, ordinary measuring sticks for success and failure just don't apply in this particular situation. And this is very important, not just to pick on the premillennialists yet again in this space, but so often the attitude that people take toward the kingdom, toward the king himself, is used as a rationalization, as it were, for Jesus not establishing the kingdom on earth in the fullness like he had intended to, allegedly, in the first century. That's exactly the opposite of the teaching that Jesus gives us here. Jesus did establish his kingdom. And ironically, we're rejecting his idea of a kingdom today for the same reason that they rejected it back then, because it doesn't look right. It doesn't have the trappings, as it were. Well, when Jesus differs with us, we need to bring our philosophy around to meet him rather than the other way around. And I know that that's going to be a challenge for us because we don't like being ill-treated any more than Peter did or any of the rest of these ones. Well, I'm sure Jesus didn't especially appreciate it either, but he was willing to tolerate it because he had the big picture in mind. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be focusing on the big picture, realizing that the spiritual kingdom that Jesus is bringing in is going to come with disappointments, if you will. It's certainly not going to look like we want it to look or expect it to look. The question of faith for us here on our end is, are we able to accept Jesus for who he is and accept what he gives us for its own sake, what it is, not what we wish it were, etc. Faith is going to fail in these kind of moments. Temporarily, it's going to fail, of course, for his disciples. Let's not let it fail for us, at least not in the big picture. Now, go on a little bit further in the story and look at verse number 10 and 11. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. At that, Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" Yet again, kind of an embellishment on the first point here. Here there's armed insurrection against the king, essentially. And Peter thinks the most natural thing in the world is to take the sword. I'm constantly amazed that there are two swords with the party, and Peter just happens to be carrying one of them. That seems just about right, par for the course. At any rate, Peter's ready to stir things up. He's ready to go to the mattresses. And Jesus says no. In fact, it's going to be the opposite of that. Jesus does not seek out confrontation with physical authorities, with governmental authorities. In fact, he does exactly the opposite. Put your sword away. He's de-escalating rather than escalating. And in our society, in the last 100 years or so, even more than that, really, in America, as we have seen the body of Christ used as a hammer to accomplish social change, political change, etc., this is a real head scratcher for us. And it's difficult for us to go back to the beginning as Jesus had it, because it's been done the opposite way, the exact opposite way, so many times, and with a certain degree of success in the political realm. Jesus says that is not what we do. We are not about changing the climate in the world. We're not about changing governments. We're about submitting to Jesus. I mean, a worldly kingdom, by its very definition, is altering the landscape, is changing the way people think, changing the way people operate, certainly in their own spheres, bring social and economic and political change. And Jesus is not doing any of that. In fact, it's exactly the opposite of that. We read in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 1 and 3, Paul writes here, "First of all, then I urge that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings, and for all those who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good, and it pleases God our Savior, who wants everyone to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth." Going through verse number 4 there. The point you might take from this, we're praying that the First Amendment be secured and that we be allowed to worship in peace, and that such officials be elected so that they would be able to preserve those rights. And I think it's an appropriate prayer, and I think that fits generally into the context of 1 Timothy chapter 2. But the main point that he's getting at here is simply to ask God to allow us to do our thing and to pray for government in a general sort of sense so that we can live a tranquil and quiet life. Well, what if the government won't let us live a tranquil life? Well, I guess we're going to go to war then. I guess we're going to pick up arms and grab a sword and go hack somebody. That's what Peter wanted to do. But that's not what Jesus wants to do. That's not what Jesus' disciples in the first century wanted to do. Peter himself writes about this in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13. "Submit to every human authority because of the Lord, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors as those sent out by him to punish those who do what is evil and to praise those who do what is good. For it is God's will that you silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. Submit as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but as God's slaves. Honor everyone, love the brothers and sisters, fear God, honor the emperor." So many loopholes are closed by what Jesus representative here, Peter, says. Well, what if the government is oppressive? Well, oppressive like Rome? The Roman government that wound up killing Peter for doing the right thing? Is that the oppressive government you're talking about? He says, honor the king, submit to the governor, submit to his representatives, do what the government tells you to do. There are exceptions to that, of course, but not because of personal comfort, not because of restrictions placed on your freedom. You do what the government tells you to do. And hopefully, at least, you're going to silence the ignorance of those foolish people by doing this good. Well, what if it doesn't do that? What if I turn the other cheek and the fellow in question just slaps that one too? Jesus covers that. You may recognize the language from the Sermon on the Mount. Sometimes doing good is not going to work political good in the world around us. Jesus tells us that. It didn't in Jesus' life. It didn't in the life of his apostles, at least not generally it didn't. And it probably won't in yours or mine. That doesn't mean the system is broken. That doesn't mean we need to rewrite Jesus' rules. That means we need to just step back and allow Jesus to do his work in his way, a way that you may or may not understand, a way that you may or may not see with your own eyes working within your lifetime, within your reach. How much faith are we going to have in Jesus for this? How much confidence do we have for him to do his will in his way? Or do we think that the gospel needs a tweak, that it needs an update, it needs a revision, it needs extra muscle power from our human end to make sure that God on his divine end is able to do the things that he wants to do? I mean, the more you talk about this, the more ridiculous it sounds, doesn't it? Jesus is quite clear here in John chapter 18. His disciples clearly agreed with him. This is the way they taught. This is the way they lived, by de-escalating conflict rather than escalating. That doesn't mean you can't be politically active, especially in a liberal democracy like ours. It doesn't mean you shouldn't go vote or whatever. You can have your own opinions, your own judgments on that. What he is saying is this, and we need to listen to what he's saying. What he's saying is your job as a citizen here on earth is not to behave as you wish so that you can get the life that you think you're entitled to, the life that you think Jesus is guaranteeing you. You're ultimately, first and foremost, a citizen of heaven living on earth. And that means you abide by Jesus' rules at all times and pray for opportunities to be able to do that safely, securely. And if you don't get that, well, you do it anyway, to the best of your ability, and trust God to see you through to the end. Now, there is a bit of a twist with regard to this. Jesus, by and large, lets all these things happen. And it may come across like you're not allowed to defend yourself at all. You're not allowed to speak up on your own behalf. If the government arrests you, then you just go to jail and that's all there is and just plead guilty and blah, blah, blah. That's not necessarily the case. Jesus does speak up a little bit. The text in Isaiah chapter 53 that says that he was like a lamb before its shearers, he was dumb, he never opened his mouth. That's not literally true. That's saying prophetically that Jesus would not defend himself. He would not try to get out of this task, this duty, this responsibility, this future that clearly he was destined for. He was going to allow that to happen. He did open his mouth, literally. He opened it before Pilate, and he opens it in front of Caiaphas also. In John chapter 18 and verse number 19, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples, and he speaks, "I've spoken openly in the world. I've taught in the synagogue and the temple where all the Jews congregate, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who've heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said." And when he had said those things, one of the officials standing by slapped Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" And Jesus responds in verse number 23, "If I have spoken wrongly, give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, why did you hit me?" Jesus is not trying to stop the process. The wheels are going to grind the way they're going to grind. That's obvious here. That's God's plan. That's Jesus' plan. But there is certainly a sense in which you can acknowledge that bad things are being done by bad people, and that we're being victimized by that, pointing that out and seeing, letting the chips fall where they may. That's not necessarily a problem. Paul does this essentially in Acts chapter 16, verse 37, after being thrown in jail for no good reason and left there for no good reason and beaten, as is not right for a Roman citizen to have done to him. They come back the next day. They're willing to let him go and let this thing all disappear, essentially. And Paul says no in verse number 37. They arrested us publicly. They can come here and let us out publicly. Paul has rights, and he's not necessarily averse to asserting those rights. If we're not suggesting here that if the government comes and shuts the church down, well, I guess we just got to go. I guess you just got to do what you got to do. No, you can live as free men in a free society. That's if it was true in a not free society like Rome. Certainly it's true for us also. But let's not kid ourselves in thinking that somehow we can be immune, as it were. That God's rules don't apply to us just because people are being mean to us. People are being unfair to us. There is going to be injustice in the world. Yes, and we can point out that this is a matter of injustice. And it may be that the people around us, when they see what's happening to us, they see the injustice in the world, that they admire our character. They are drawn toward us, like people were no doubt drawn toward Paul and Silas, and they give Jesus a chance here. But this only works when we defend ourselves, you want to call it defending yourself, in a polite and kind and respectful kind of way. If we lash out in kind, if we just pick up a sword like Peter was trying to and just lash out as just one enemy fighting against another, there's no obvious distinction between those two. Jesus calls us to something different. He calls us to a spiritual warfare fought with spiritual weapons, with ultimately a spiritual finish line and a spiritual reward at the end. That's what an unworldly kingdom is going to look like. And people who know nothing of unworldly kings, who have never heard of an unworldly king, an unworldly kingdom, are going to be very, very confused. They're going to be confused at what we're trying to say to them. That doesn't mean we change things. That means we are patient and loving and supportive of these ones like Jesus was and is with us as we try to find his truth, as we try to submit to his truth. It's a confusing concept, no question about it. And I don't flatter myself to think that I've explained it so well here today that there are no questions whatsoever. It's a deep, challenging concept, and one that I'm not prepared to spend 6 hours talking about here today. But I'll at least throw this out there for you to chew on for a little bit today. If Jesus' kingdom is not getting you where you want to be, if it is not accomplishing the things that you see as the mission of the church, if it seems like he's coming up short in the results department, etc., that does not necessarily mean that Jesus isn't king, or that we need to do a better job, or that we need to change the rules or throw the baby out with the bathwater, or whatever cliche you want to use here. In fact, if we have enough faith that Jesus is in fact king, that the battle has in fact already been won in the halls of heaven, then we should have enough faith and enough confidence, enough patience to stand our ground and do what Jesus has told us to do in the midst of oppression, in the midst of opposition, and believe that in the end we are going to be vindicated. We may wind up being like these souls whose blood is spilled out before the altar in Revelation, and calling out for vengeance. Jesus hears. Jesus knows these things. In the end, we will be shown to be victorious. You may or may not be alive when that happens, but ultimately, the spiritual battle that we're engaged in is going to go our way because we are on the side of Jesus, because we are citizens of his kingdom, and we know that we're going to be victorious because he's going to be victorious in the end. So keep your faith, keep your confidence, and draw near to Jesus, especially in these times of difficulty when it seems like the world is just absolutely lined up against us. It is lined up against us. But Jesus will be victorious, and so will you if you hold fast to Jesus. Thank you very much for your attention. Please continue to study, and God bless.